Well, good evening and welcome to the BJCP study group. John Mallett will be with us shortly. The cold, I guess, has created some computer issues on his end. We want to blame it on that anyway. So hopefully John will be up momentarily. I'm going to be checking the screen as I look for him. So I'll be a little bit distracted until I get him up on screen. Let's see. No, still not live yet. Okay. So I've got to kind of watch that. Anyway, I'm glad to have you on board this evening, this very cold evening, or at least for those of us on the East Coast. That excludes our friends in Florida. I see we've had a couple of folks there in Florida. I know your weather's a bit more pleasant. John had said this morning was minus 17 degrees in Kalamazoo. So that's pretty serious cold. Greenville, South Carolina, where I'm from, I think we hit 21 maybe was our low, and it warmed up maybe to the middle 40s today. So really quite pleasant. We do have on screen, I think, although it may have disappeared here. Yeah, there it is. We are going to be talking about a Guinness Stout, and my beer cam has decided to go out of focus. There we go. Well, it's going to float in and out. But anyway, you get an idea. We have a Guinness Foreign Extra Stout. We will be talking about that, and John's going to kind of lead into the webinar with that momentarily. So again, I'm working with John right now and trying to get him up on screen, and so we will hopefully have a little luck with that in just a moment. While we're waiting on John, let me kind of walk you through some of the screens that we've got, and then we can jump right into the webinar when I see John jump up there on screen. And again, I've got to watch for him. All right. So we have a couple of things going on. First of all, we are going to talk about a Guinness Foreign Extra Stout, and John's going to kind of unpack that for us. And I do appreciate you joining me today, and as we grow not only our beer skills, but apparently today some of our technical skills. We also just wanted to let you know that down here at the bottom of the screen, we've got on quite a few options. If this is the first time that you've ever used Crowdcast, there is an option right there in the center to join our BJCP study group. There's John, I hope. So our BJCP study group, just to the right of that is an Ask a Question field.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I do hear you. That's a big improvement.
Let's see here.
I was just telling John, I'll keep talking. So we have Ask the Question down there, and it looks like we've got 13 questions already.
Here.
So that's going to be cool.
Join BJCP.
Yeah, you don't need to worry about that one. And also that the chat screen, I see everybody's kind of getting the hang of the chat screen. I would just encourage you to use that kind of.
Mute mic, disable camera, flip camera, leave screen.
Share where you're from. John, we are live, by the way.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. That's not good. Anyway, we'll continue on. Everybody's saying they can hear you, John. Let's see. We can hear you.
All right. I can't hear you, but hey, whatever, you know. This is just all right. I've had quite a day. I wanted to since I can't hear you, I'm just going to talk and wait for my computer to finish updating, which it determined it needed to do desperately just before. So, Doug, I'm going to give you a minute if you want to. I assume maybe you've introduced me. Do you want me to? You can just nod or whatever. Tell me, do we want to drink beer right now? Because I'm about ready to start drinking something beyond that.
I think it's time for a beer. This is a rough start, and it's cold.
Okay, and again, I can't hear you, so this is. I'm operating from my cell phone right now. It's goofy as hell. Well, all right. Well, I guess I could probably get started. I'm gonna grab the beer that we wanted to taste today, which is Guinness Extra Stout. And let me see if I can grab this right here. Oh, look at that. Little Guinness Extra Stout. Let me get my glass. And I see some names up there on the screen that are familiar. It's great to hear you all. I'll tell you that today in Michigan, when I left my house, it was like 17 degrees out, so it's effing cold. So with that, the beer that I chose today was this Guinness Extra Stout. As I was talking to Doug in preparation for this, it's my understanding that there's quite a few members who are from outside of the country, and you would thought, it'd be great to drink a nice Bell's beer, but Bell's beer is not available everywhere in the U.S. and certainly not worldwide. We are a pretty big exporting brewery. We go all the way to Puerto Rico, and we go through many states, but not all. So I thought, Guinness Foreign Extra Stout, it's a real classic, and it's a beer that's really drives on malt flavors, and then some other interesting flavors that we'll talk about later as well. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour this beer into this mouth, but first I'm going to put it into this glass. So there we go. So as I start to pour it, you see it starts to pour a really nice thick foam to it.
Well, that's
and
a serious
this beer is different than the nitrogenated versions, although you can see it still builds a really nice foam to it. And I think that foam is important because it's one of the things that malt helps to drive, that malt's really quite responsible for. So with that, I'm pouring the glass in there. I'm taking a look at it first visually. It's just an absolutely beautiful beer. It's got a sort of darkish hue to the foam itself. Oh, and it's got a really nice sort of clean yeast character to it. Some light malt, sort of light dark malt flavors, a little bit of coffee or chocolate, and then like just a beautiful kind of character to it. Excuse me. I pick up a little bit, if I kind of work backwards, right now what's happened in my mouth that when I first put it in there, it's not like an overbearingly sweet beer. It's a pretty neutral beer. It's got some nice malt flavors, and the malt flavors that it really exemplifies at the completion of drinking, we get these really nice sort of like ashy-like character, the characteristic sort of ash flavor to it. And that is because that the malt and the barley that are used in this have been roasted to such a high degree that, we've nearly incinerated them. And with that near incineration comes a removal of a lot of the flavor. So although we get that nice ash character, we don't have a lot of the kind of caramel flavors. We don't have a ton of the real sweet malt or biscuit flavors. We don't have a lot of just straight sweetness that we would taste if we were just making a straight wort, an unfermented beer. Okay. All right. That's pretty good. I'm enjoying that quite a bit. Woo. All right.
So, John, I don't think...
Is that good? Should I talk more about this? Nod your head, Doug. I can see you. This is just the goofiest thing I've ever done. Usually I love presenting, and I do it fairly often. And being on a platform where suddenly nothing's working, where suddenly nothing's working is is certainly a challenge. I'm just kind of rearranging all my power here to try to get this situation resolved.
So,
right, let's see here.
While John is doing that,
oh,
we will continue on. So please hang in there. There've been some some serious technical issues.
I have no idea why I can't hear a thing through this, but hey, whatever.
So we will eventually get into and start to cover the questions from T15, discuss the role of malt and yeast in beer characteristics. John had specifically chosen the Guinness Extra Stout, Foreign Extra Stout, because he felt like it exemplified a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about that requires malt. So, John, we are hearing you, but I guess you're not hearing us.
Was that like, I'm sorry, I couldn't see that, Doug.
Oh, yeah.
It's like super tiny. Let's see here. Oh, we can hear you. Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, well, maybe I'll just start talking about malt. Well, to kind of give you some stuff. I had a nice little PowerPoint. Maybe it'll come up soon. I'll be able to get on it. But until then, let's talk about malt. And specifically, what we're talking about today are some of the questions associated with the BJCP. And, when I think about the questions that are there, we really want to think about, what is malt? What is malt and how does it impact beer and beer flavor? So if I think about malt, malting has been going on for a long time. Interestingly, malt actually predates the advent or the growth of wheat. Wheat as a variety did not actually arise until after people had been making malt. People, the sort of hunter-gatherers, moving through the landscape, found these ample grains, things like rye and some of the proto-wheats, and began to harvest them and eat them. And these were, fairly small. They're not improved like they are today, like nice, plump, big kernels, but were pretty small. And at some point, somebody figured out that, if we take these grains and we allow them to turn them into gruel, or if we allow them to rest for a while and then dry them out, that we get some pretty nice flavors and even nicer effects in that the grain begins to produce alcohol. And, physically what's happening there is that the grain is a seed. I think about that barley kernel as being a lot like an egg. There's an outer shell, the husk. There's a young embryo inside of that, encased inside that husk. And then there's these ample energy reserves in the form of starches. And what starches look like at sort of a molecular level are long chains of sugars. So sugar is a 6 oxygen, 12 hydrogen molecule. And if we string them together, sort of like a sugar linked to a sugar linked to a sugar in these long chains, that's starch, and that's the way the grain reserves energy inside of there. That is not digestible in its native form by people. We need to chew that up, and the enzymes in our mouth break that down into sugars, which we then can assimilate. And that's a similar situation for yeast. Yeast cannot eat long chains of these carbohydrates, but needs to be broken down to simple sugars. And the process, your sound input source, it may not be the headphone jack, is not selected for this application. Well, thanks, Ken. I'm actually right now I'm on my iPhone, perched up on front of my computer, which was rebooting for whatever, who the hell knows what reason. But so these long chains of sugars, we want to break them down. And the way that those get broken down is the process of malting. In nature, the grain is going to use those energy reserves to fuel that embryo, to fuel the young plant growth. And enzymes, which are naturally present in there, are going to facilitate that. And malting is really manipulating those enzymes to break down the starches into sugars and to make those energies available to get into wort. So we have not only a conversion, but also an accessibility that needs to be addressed. So how does that work? Well, the process of malting is really 3 steps. It is steeping, it is germination, and it's kilning. And we'll go into each of these for just a second. Steeping is just simply putting grain into water and allowing it to stand for a couple of days. Oftentimes in the malt house, there'll be a few water changes. And really what this is doing is mimicking when the spring rains come and soak down that barley kernel. Soak down that barley kernel, and that's what initiates this growth process. The next phase is germination. And in commercial malting, presently in the United States, that germination phase lasts roughly 4 days. And during this phase, the grain is allowed to grow. And as that grain starts to grow, it sends out rootlets, and it also begins to grow the acrospire, what would be the stalk of the plant. And that acrospire starts to grow up inside of the kernel and eventually poke its way out. And as that acrospire makes its way under the husk of the barley, this is roughly attuned with the enzymatic changes occurring in the endosperm. At some point, if we just allowed this to grow, we would get a couple things happening. One, we would get this matted mass of grain, that the sort of the little rootlets would tangle together, and the eventual acrospires would tangle together, and it would just form this impenetrable mat. It would also smother itself, kill itself, and end up with horrible putrefying flavors. And the last thing is, if we allowed it to go to completion, then all of the energy reserves would be used up. So in malting, the kilning stage is really used to halt that process. Now, that process, that termination of germination, the halting of germination, occurs with kilning, with drying it out. And when when we dry that out, they're put into large beds, and air is blown through it. And as that air blows through the grain, it's removing moisture. We want to use some heated air because it's got a greater carrying capacity for removing moisture. And it also causes flavor changes within the barley kernel. So if we take the same barley, we can treat it different ways. We could allow it to germinate for longer or slower. We could, change the temperature of that. So we have time, we have temperature. We have airflow through there that could be changed. We could change the amount of water that was used initially, how much hydration it would get. But in the end, we end up with a germinated kernel. During the kilning step, we can vary the time, the temperature, and the humidity at which that grain is dried out. Now, the way that this works is if we just built we took a screen door and we put a screen door over a fire and spread some malt on there, then that would dry out. The convection of air rising off of the fire and flowing through the malt would dry it away. Within the malt house, we have the ability to take that air and recirculate it. So bring that moist air back in and move it through there. And what this causes is this will cause changes in color and flavor inside the malt. So going through with a base malt, a white malt, as the British call it, just for Americans, we might just call it brewer's malt. Really what we're trying to do is to put in the so the minimum amount of heat required to dry it out so that we don't get color development. And at the same time, we're also trying to minimize the impact to enzymes which are naturally formed inside that barley kernel. When we increase the heat, we're going to increase color. And it's a lot of the similar reactions and pathways that occur with taking a pale piece of bread and turning it into toast. We could gently warm the bread. We could toast the bread so we get a nice sort of golden color, or we could nearly incinerate it. And so when I think about malts, there's really a few, there's many types of malt, but there are really a few categories of malt or families that everything falls into. So the first is, what are the first type of malt, which we might call base malt or two-row brewer's pale, or whatever that's called at your local store, is that minimal heat input and drying temperature. Beyond that, we could take that same malt and at the end of that kilning sequence, raise the temperature up. And as we raise the temperature up, then these sort of golden colors start to develop. I think about some of the flavors that we get from a Munich malt. A Munich malt is a sort of high dried or kiln malt where we allow the temperature to rise up and we get some of these great flavors. The next thing we could do would be to take the barley at its fully germinated state and begin to circulate warm, moist air around it, and recirculate that warm, warm, moist air. And what will happen inside the kernel is that the enzymatic conversion that we eventually will get in the mash tun occurs inside the kernel. So in a lot of ways, we're mashing in the husk. What will occur then is these long chains of starches are broken down into sugars, and the sugars will then combine with the amino acids that sort of protein fragments that are just present in barley. And this combination kicks off a set of reactions called Maillard reactions. And those Maillard reactions are responsible for a ton of flavor and also color development. So a classic example of this would be a caramel malt. And think about, something like, my favorite caramel malts, one that we really just absolutely adore using at the brewery, is Simpson's 5060. And to me, this just encompasses these great sort of caramel flavors, really just absolutely lovely. So Tom is saying, so that mashing in the husk behind the creation of crystal caramel malts. Absolutely, Tom. What's happening inside of there is those enzymes breaking down the starches into sugars, and then as more heat is added, those sugars are combining under warm, moist conditions with amino acids, protein fragments, to form these Maillard reaction products. And again, I just think of that great sort of biscuity character that you get, and I think about like sort of a crackery, biscuity thing, maybe like what are they? Those airplane crackers, the Bischoffs. There's some of that flavor that's going on there. Those things are pretty sweet, but they also have that flavor. I also think of the great flavors that we get from sort of like a Triscuit or something like that. Some of these flavors to me are just are wonderful malt characters. And then the third or the fourth broad family of malts. So we've got our pale or white malt. We have our high dried malt like Munich. We have a caramel malt or crystal malt, and those are really sort of the same family. The last one is the roasted malts. And for these, we can take white malt and put it inside of a roasting drum, sort of think like a coffee roaster, and tumble them around with heat. And during that heating phase, we now begin to like toast them, and they become quite black. With some of them, we go up in color the longer and hotter we get. So we might start out with something that's fairly dark brown, move into a really dark brown, like a chocolate malt, and eventually you get to a black malt. And that black malt is really what's responsible for making a beer like this. And we know that we make stouts that we don't need to use that much black malt to really impart that color, to get that super darkness in there. That's so drinkable. I like that beer a lot. So So we've got these, these quite dark kind of characteristics, colors that we're developing, and that 500 Lovibond. I mean, you think about it, that's 250 times the color impact of a similar, very pale malt. Not a lot of fermentable extract in there, pretty much nothing. And when they're producing it, it's pretty close to the temperature that spontaneous combustion would occur. So it can be kind of a dangerous. Dangerous. I guess you're on the thin edge there. So those are some of the flavors that we're really getting out of malt. I also think about some of the off flavors that would be associated with malt. So what could you get from if I'm thinking about judging beers, tasting beers, what doesn't work? Well, I think a careful hand is important. That if you are overloading it with something like black malt, then clearly you're going to get these really overly astringent characteristics to it. So that's a pretty simple one. I remember back years ago when I first started judging beer, it seemed like everybody was using some carapils, and they thought, oh, some carapils good, more better, and you would get just this real characteristic kind of off, almost, for me it was almost like soapy kind of character to the malt. Other flavors that we could get from malt, certainly sort of a tannic or astringent characteristic. That can be a result of really beating up husk and allowing the components, the tannins in there to leach into the grain. Certainly we know that water chemistry is really important for minimizing this. That water chemistry can, if we get into some higher pH stuff, it's going to selectively pull those into solution, and that's going to give us bad results. Other flavors we can get from malt. So the malt, has got a lot of the precursor for DMS, dimethyl sulfide, that kind of cooked cabbage character to it. And that DMS precursor, S-methylmethylene, is actually degraded at warmer temperatures. So when we get into traditional malting practices for English malts, we start to destroy that S-methylmethylene, which then removes the ability for that malt to throw a DMS character. If we want to make a very pale beer, then we want to use pale malts, and those very pale malts don't go through those. You can't go through those temperatures, and so therefore we need to do something different with that. And the basis of controlling that DMS in the final beer is a great kettle boil. It is the conversion and removal. It's like vapor distillation is what's going to pull it out of there. So if we're smelling, in this sort of cooked cabbage character in a beer, we know that number one, that the malts that were used had this precursor in it, and then number two, that it was not effectively removed in the kettle boil. So good rolling kettle boil for ample time is what's going to get it out of there. We can't boil pale beers endlessly because they do pick up color. I think about the color that we get in pale American lager beer, like a majority of that color is actually developed in the kettle. So the wort that comes in is quite pale, and then picks up color and exits as still a pretty pale beer. So those are some of the off flavors that I associate with malt. Let me think here, Doug. How we doing on time here? We doing okay? All right, great.
Doing great.
Okay, so if we thought about list 4 distinct beer styles associated with malts. So for me, if we look at those 4 different characteristic malts, we've got our base malt. For me, this is a Pilsner malt, and therefore a Pilsner beer is going to exemplify it. Think about the flavors that we'll get in a classic Czech Pils. There might be a small amount of that DMS that sits in there, and it's interesting, but in England, that DMS character is actually positively associated with lager beers. They want a little bit of it in there. It gives sort of a grassiness. It gives, just what they would, one of the flavors that they would associate with malt. The next type I think about would be a kiln malt, a high dried malt. So Munich malt, and for me, the absolute epitome of that is an Oktoberfest, a fest beer, and like sort of a traditional Vienna to Oktoberfest. In that spectrum, it gets this wonderful, wonderful sort of, to me, what maltiness is. I think that is absolutely associated with that style. The next would be a caramel malt. I think about caramel malt as being amber beers, something with complementary, not overwhelming hop character. Certainly you can have some hops in there, but for that malt to really shine through, it needs to balance and play a secondary role. And so for me, an American amber, like the Bell's Amber for me, with that awesome Simpsons 50/60, really shows off, what that malt and the relationship. Slightly caramely, just round and rich, full. That to me is what that is. And then the last type are the roasted malts. These very high dried. So that's anything in the porter or stout category, and certainly the beer that we're drinking right now has got that. Interestingly, with regular Guinness Draft, a lot of that color is not coming from roasted malt, but just roasted barley. So in the same way that we've taken this white malt, this pale malt, and then put it through a coffee drum-like roaster, we can do that same thing with unmalted barley and get that same characteristic. The very white head that's associated with Guinness, that to me is a sign of what's happening there. The browner color here, that to me shows that there's a little bit of the malting presence during that kilning. Okay, and I will tell you that I am so over right now technology. I mean, I use it every day and I love it. For whatever reason, when it screws up, kind of screws up my world. So apologize for being rattled. Okay. Yeah, my PC is not even firing up right now for some reason. It's just ridiculous. Well, I'll tell you a funny thing that, today we've had, exceptionally cold weather in the upper Midwest, where, this polar vortex has come down. It's just been like beautifully cold. I was out skiing the other night. It was great, but it's really cold. And then yesterday, in the middle of the day, we've got word that in Michigan, the gas compressor station, which carries like 64% of the energy in the state, caught fire and burned up. And this is like a huge thing. So the state contacted us. They contacted Ford. They contacted something like 80 businesses and said, "Is it possible that you could cease production? We're asking you to cease production until we can get this straightened out, so that we have enough gas to keep everybody warm." And so we were dealing with that. That was an event. And then the last thing that was going on is we have spent grain at the brewery, and the spent grain goes out into this area with a silo, and then the farmer comes by and picks it up. Well, the bottom of that thing just froze solid. We have got heaters on there. So it's like kind of like an obstructed, pooper there. So we had to get that. So right now we've got gas again. We're passing spent grain. Everything's good there. I get a dead computer. This is small stuff. I'm talking on my phone. I'm just really happy that I'm here doing any of it, and happy that I'm drinking a beer with y'all. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is yeast. Yeast is it does the work at the brewery. We just kind of set the table. We try and set the table so that the party can happen, and then the yeast bring that party, and it does a great job. So yeast, single-celled microorganism that's going to eat those, consume those carbohydrates in the form of sugars and create from it carbon dioxide and alcohol. And if we think about the sugar unit as being a Have another beer, John. You've earned it. Okay, if you insist. I'm just gonna figure out where my bottle opener is. Oh, there it is. So that yeast is going to consume those sugars. Those sugars again are a 6 carbon, 6 oxygen, 12 hydrogen package, and stoichiometrically, if we take that sugar and break it apart. We can break it up to produce 1 alcohol, which has 2 carbons, 6 hydrogens, and an oxygen, and also 2 carbon dioxide. So C, 1 carbon and 2 oxygens. And the masses of those are somewhat similar, so that if we took 100 grams of sugar and fermented it out, we would get roughly 50 grams of alcohol and 50 grams of CO2. So yeast, taxonomically falls into a couple of different categories. For a long time, for most of human history, there's been not pure cultures, but the predominant yeast that's been involved with beer making is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ale yeast. And within that family, over time, it has diverged into a bunch of different strains. This is the same stuff that is used for fermenting breads. And, we're not harnessing the alcohol component, we're harnessing the carbon dioxide component. I think about how much carbon dioxide is released in fermentation, it's quite a bit. If you took a gallon or a liter, say, of 12 Plato wort, and you fermented it, it would create carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, as a gas, occupies more volume for weight. But that volume of that would be somewhere in the range of like 22 liters of carbon dioxide if you measured it at sort of standard temperature and pressure. So there's a lot of CO2 that's generated, and that's what's being harnessed to make bread and cause that bread to rise. There are other types of yeasts out there, and we're certainly familiar with Brettanomyces, the British yeast. And Brettanomyces was identified in a Belgian beer originally, and was said, hey, this is the yeast of Britain. So Brettanomyces, the British yeast, has got some different characteristics. It produces different flavors, and it can utilize different carbohydrates through a divergent pathway. There's also another type of yeast, which is sometimes called Vivarium or Pasteurinatus, and really this is a hybridized yeast. The lager yeasts are hybridized. So there was a yeast which is known as Baianus, and has been discovered living in like the galls of oak trees in Patagonia, and it appears that this yeast hybridized with that of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ale yeast, to produce lager yeast. And the lager yeast is interesting because it is able to assimilate a different set of sugars, and also is able to operate at much lower temperatures. That yeast, I think broadly of ales and lagers, and if I was going to make a broad generalization, I say ales are wow, that produce these great sort of estery, fruity characteristics, can be quite flavorful, and lagers are more these very smooth, delicate, more sulfur-driven characteristics, which are often are often present. So broadly, we have ale yeast, we have lager yeast, and then we've got these other yeasts, these wild yeasts that are also out there, and Brettanomyces is among them. So what does Brett do that's different than those? Let's back up. So for ale yeast has a pretty easy time assimilating 1 and 2 sugar chains. So again, when we think about those long chains of carbohydrates that start out in malt and are broken down into maybe 1 or 2 or maybe 3 sugar units, then ale would be able to process anything with 1 or 2 sugar units, but doesn't have the capability to break down anything beyond that. Lager yeast is able to break down maltotriose, so this is a three-sugar or a three-sugar chain, and it's able to bring that in, and then it stops as well. Interestingly, with some of the wild yeasts, they are able to produce enzymes which break down longer chain carbohydrates into something assimilable. So how does that manifest itself? When I'm drinking a beer like Orval, Orval I think is just absolutely brilliant. It is, as a brewery, we need to make a lot of different wort strains. We make one wort strain to make stout. We make another wort strain to make Oberon. We make another wort strain to make amber. And so all of these wort strains individually to make the beers that we make. For me, Orval makes a couple of different beers, and they do it all in one wort stream. And the way that manifests itself is that Orval, when it's first bottled, is young, and there's some sweetness in there. And over time, there's Brettanomyces in Orval, and over time, as that beer matures, then those longer chain sugars are broken down and consumed, and the beer becomes drier, and it becomes more, I don't know, I just love the character of it. I'm having a hard time, saying what I'm saying right now, but I just think about the delicate sort of almost pineapple-like esters that are created in that secondary fermentation or that tertiary fermentation that's occurring with Brettanomyces. So Brettanomyces has these exogenous enzymes. The other thing it'll do is it will create more carbon dioxide and raises the carbonation level, which in turn drops the pH, and which enhances that really beautiful dry characteristics in the beer. So with yeast, if we're looking at strains, beyond strains, we've also got some great ways to manipulate flavors inside of. So the question is does Orval intentionally add Brett when they package or in the secondary? Yes, they do. They do put Brett in. They mix it in prior to packaging, and it's a pretty small amount of it. And that's really a characteristic of what happens inside of Orval. Hold on one second. I'm just gonna swear or stomp my feet or something.
Okay, while John is doing that, I appreciate everybody hanging in there. We will continue on, and I think John's about to wrap up the more formal part of this, but I think we still will be able to answer the questions because it'll be just a matter of going through the questions. So I see we've got 17 questions.
I might be selling a computer real cheap here. There we go. All right. Okay. Sorry about that.
Keep going.
So Orval's kind of got this wonderful characteristic, and the other things that we can do to manipulate yeast flavors beyond just strain selection include what temperature are we fermenting it at. So, in general, the warmer we ferment, the more sort of fruity, estery characteristics we're going to get with it. So if we think about where beers want, or where different, is cameraman your second job, John? Yeah. So where different yeasts want to ferment. Lager yeasts want to ferment at slightly colder temperatures. Ales are more moderate. We think about something in the 48 to 50s, 52 range in Fahrenheit for lager beers. For ales, we're up somewhere in the 66 to 70 degrees is a great temperature for many ale yeast to be going on. Some of the saison yeast want to be fermenting hotter than that, and then things like Kveik, this Norwegian yeast, that the stuff is fermenting at very warm temperatures. If we take those same yeasts, if we take something like a lager yeast and we ferment it at warm temperatures, we're going to start to get a very different flavor characteristics. The classic example of this would be this is steam beer. Anchor Steam from San Francisco, California, these beers were fermented warm, and they get some much more fruity characteristics than that yeast would produce at more normal lager temperatures. Next thing that we have that we can control with yeast is pitching rate, addition rate. How much yeast do we start to ferment with? So if the yeast is if you put very little yeast in a beer, then it's going to multiply many, many times. And as it multiplies many times, then you're going to express different characteristics. I think about something like Weizen beer really exemplifies, Hefeweizen really exemplifies some of these characteristics. Weizen beer is utilizing a strain that is an ale strain, but it's sort of divergent from the American strains that we're used to, and it wants to throw sort of phenolic character to it. Sometimes in brewery circles, this is called POF, or phenolic off flavor. Personally, I love phenolic flavors. Belgian strains and the Hefeweizen strains, this is what really exemplifies those. And again, I just love these characteristics. And beyond that, again, if we're pitching yeast at varying levels, then we're going to get different flavors out of there. Yeast growth is associated with esters, and so therefore underpitching or overpitching will change the beer. To me, this is a real area of opportunity for many homebrewers. And if we're judging beers in the BJCP beer judge certification program, then good yeast control is a real area that one could be aware of. For the most part, I find many homebrew examples to be underpitched, so not sufficient yeast. And I'll tell you, at our brewery, we are very particular, very careful with how much yeast we're putting in there, that it's known and it's consistent. And that's not always the case if you're using like Smack Pack or you don't have that the visibility into there. So I think about that's another place. Another thing that I look at with yeast is aeration. So how did we do getting air into the wort? Oxygen is absolutely essential for yeast health. Yeast is metabolizing oxygen to produce sterols, which make the outer cell wall flexible. And if we do not provide sufficient oxygen, then that yeast can have a difficult time uptaking nutrients. So slow and lagging ferments at the end of the ferment cycle can be a problem, and the sort of flavors associated with it. If I think about how do these things manifest themselves, what are some of the flavors that we get associated with fermentation? We also have off flavors. So one of those off flavors that we may have is a green apple characteristic. This is acetaldehyde. And really, acetaldehyde is generated early in fermentation and then reuptaken later. So acetaldehyde is a major component or a major reason why we mature beers, why we lager beers, is to allow the uptake of that acetaldehyde characteristic. A second fermentation-derived common off flavor is diacetyl and the associated vicinal diketone 2,3-pentanedione. And these are sort of the buttery or butterscotch characteristics. And what's happening is that how these arise is that it has to do with uptake and synthesis of amino acids by the yeast. So these amino acids are utilized by the yeast to build additional yeast, and the sort of valine, leucine, these sorts of things. So diacetyl is a result of a precursor, which is called alpha acetolactate, and that alpha acetolactate is generated by yeast and put out into the ferment, and as it goes out into the beer, eventually it's going to be reuptaken. And I've often likened this to the way that so if you had if you had like a 7-year-old kid party, 7-year-old kid party, and you put out a bunch of pizza, then the kids all run in and they pick up a piece of pizza and they eat the easily assimilable part, the cheesy part, and they throw the pizza bones, the crust, back on the plate, and then they go outside and they play. And eventually, when they're hungry enough, they're going to come back in, and at that point, they're going to uptake that component, the pizza crust. And